Good evening. My name is Martin Kragh. I'm the head of the Russia and Eurasia Programme here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon seminar on the human rights situation in the occupied territories of Eastern Ukraine. With us to shed important light on this topic, often neglected topic in our public debate, we have two excellent speakers. Halya Coynash, an investigative journalist specializing on, among other things, the occupied territories in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And my colleague Andreas Umland, a researcher with us here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, although currently based in Kiev, Ukraine, where he has been working for many years. We also have a publication which I can highlight like this. You can find it on our website. It's free to download, and it deals with the topic that we are discussing here today. Our seminar is about 1 hour, so each presenter will have about 10-15 minutes each, after which we will have a more informal Q&A, where you will be able to address the panel through the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So Halya, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Well, I'd like to begin by stressing one absolutely crucial factor when we're talking about occupied Donbas, about the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which I think has absolutely major ramifications for every part of human rights, the human rights issues that we will be addressing. And this is that basically these so-called pseudo-republics are based on a lie. They would not have ever come to being without Russian arms, without Russian militant leaders, and without effective Russian control. That control remains to this day, and it does mean that essentially, if Russia abandoned these so-called republics, they would basically probably collapse within a week. I think this is very, very important because, well, first of all, because it's completely denied by Russia, and also clearly not part of the narrative that the militant leaders use themselves. I mean, you know, they claim that these are young republics that arose as the result of a civil war in Ukraine, and this is the narrative that Russia has very much tried to push to the world. What that means, and this is very much the same as in Soviet times, I have to say, is that you know, this has major implications for the media. You can't have free media if you're based on a lie, and media was cut almost immediately. There is huge propaganda, militarization, especially of childhood, but generally. And of course, the other aspect, which will be discussed later, I believe, but I will talk about a little bit, which is repression, because clearly anybody who does not follow the narrative that the militants and Russia are following can expect to be imprisoned, basically. I'll begin by talking sort of about media, because actually it really was one of the first things that happened. I mean, as soon as the militants, who in the very beginning were actually Russians, most of them, and you know, supported by some Ukrainians, but there were some very heavily armed Russians who seized control of, you know, various cities, and immediately in each of these places where they seized control, they would cut off the television channels. Any Ukrainian television channels were cut off, and then initially they were replaced by Russian, full of warmongering at the time in 2014. Later militant channels, the so-called Republic channels, developed as well, but essentially the main thing is that no Ukrainian media is allowed. Very, very little on the internet. And the level is rather like in Soviet times. It's full of all the kind of upbeat noises about this so-called Republican leaders, etc. Generally, anything about Russia is very positive. Anything about Ukraine is extremely negative. Government-controlled Ukraine, and obviously, this is what most people are hearing. At the very beginning, there were probably still some journalists from government-controlled Ukraine. There were also journalists from international media. After a few occasions where they were tortured, imprisoned, essentially there are no freely working media in occupied Donbas, and those few very brave journalists who try to write under a pseudonym learn, like Stanislav Asiev, to their cost, that they can end up imprisoned for 31 months. At the moment, we know of, at very least, three people who could be sort of called bloggers, I guess, who were using Twitter. In one case, for sort of like disrespectful remarks about the so-called Republic. In general, probably giving information about what was happening, about military movements. But this was on Twitter. And one of them, the Marina Yurchak, is serving a supposed 15-year sentence. The other two, well, are 14 years, 13 years. The charges are officially not writing on Twitter, obviously, just as in Soviet times, you came up with something a little bit better than that. But they are all supposed to be spies. Occasionally they use the particularly grotesque state treason charge against these people. These are imitation republics who have, even when they have a criminal code, it is essentially, well, I mean, there are no grounds for believing that there is rule of law in these pseudo entities, and that means that you can safely assume that the people have not had any respect for their right to a fair trial. Well, no lawyer, or at least if there was a lawyer, the person was unlikely to have been actually trying to defend them, if you see what I mean. And the other problem with that is that, or not the other problem, the other feature, which I have to say is something that Russia uses itself in Crimea as well, which is that they are using these kind of videoed confessions, where a person is shown in a room. You can't see the person who is actually asking the questions, and they are supposedly giving a confession about how they spied for Ukraine and did this and that. This is almost certainly after torture. I mean, that's reasonably safe to assume. And it's also presumably intended as being a deterrent to others. They are shown these things where they see somebody, and I think most people can understand that it's pretty terrifying. That is probably part of the propaganda issue that I think is of really quite major concern. Here, Russia is probably playing a reasonably active role. Certainly the kind of propaganda that you see, the militarization that you see in occupied Donbas is very similar to that in Crimea. There's kind of military patriotic education, which includes an extremely distorted view of history, both of Soviet history and of recent history over the last 7 years. And also involves very frightening things like something called Yun Armia, which is the kind of youth army, which is really quite frightening, and of course is encouraging children to, well, to glorify war, to assume that they are that they should be defending this pseudo-republic, and also to hate Ukraine. A very major part of all of what I'm talking about is filled with this sort of idea that somehow Ukraine is the enemy, Russia is the friend, and that everybody in the leadership of the republics is wonderful, which is very Soviet. I'm just trying to think. Probably that anti-Ukrainian thing is very, very important, because basically, I mean, along with such propaganda, and again, very much in line with Soviet times, is that absolutely no pluralism is tolerated. That includes religion. Most, well, a large number of religious people, believers of various religions have actually left because, you know, they feared persecution. But even those who stay, I mean, Russian Orthodox Church is basically the one that is regarded as sort of proper, and the same with Muslim faith, with Islam, that, you know, there is kind of like an official mosque that is kind of accepted, the others are not. The militants in this sense are following Russia very closely in, for example, they've banned the Jehovah's Witnesses. For some reason, they seem to have also banned the Mormons, but I think I mentioned in the report that there is sort of suspicion that this may have been for purposes of gain, which I think is, you know, another thing that actually should be mentioned about these pseudo-republics is the degree to which, you know, it's really quite difficult to actually understand the motives in each individual case for a person being a victim of persecution, because it may actually be as little as, sorry, not as little as sordid as that somebody actually wanted to steal their property or something. You know, somebody will end up imprisoned because of basically of plundering. I'm just trying to think. On the subject of propaganda, I think I would just, I'm sorry, I just forgot where I was going for a second. No, it's lost.
Perhaps I can.
Yes, please. Yes, because I've just lost my thought. I'm really sorry. Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to point out that Halya's report starts with the quite simply with the Freedom House scores of comparing the Freedom House score for the Eastern Donbas, which is frighteningly low, 5 of 100 points, which is lower than even Crimea's score, which is the score for political and civil rights that Freedom House gives to various states and territories. And it's also lower than Russia's 20 points out of 100, and it's much lower than Ukraine's 62 point out of 100. I think actually Sweden is the only country that has 100 points in this table. Followed, I think, by Luxembourg and the Netherlands with almost 100 points. But maybe that would be also something to speak here about this, because that is very much related in an indirect way to the issue of human rights in the Donbas, because we have now this extremely bad human rights situation in the Donbas, and I can only refer you to the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights of the United Nations, where you have lots of testimonies, very detailed, very scary, actually, descriptions of torture, of various sorts of repressions and so on. And but the odd thing about this whole thing that the Russian and the pro-Russian rhetoric for the start of this pseudo-civil war, also for the annexation of Crimea, was exactly about allegedly violated human rights.
Yes.
And in a way, of course, Russia is right, because Ukraine has only 62 points out of 100, and not like Sweden 100 out of 100 points. Ukraine is only ranked partly free and not fully free.
Yeah.
So there's always, and that is also to what Halya already referred, that was also the Soviet rhetoric once, or the Bolshevik rhetoric, that, you need to do a revolution in order to, for equality, for human beings, for, for a better living. Yeah. And so this was also here, oddly, the rhetoric of Russia. And I'm mentioning here because many people in the West bought that. They actually, they bought the argument. There's something with the Russian speakers. Ukraine is not an ideal country, and it's still not an ideal country, and it's still only partly free, even according to Freedom House. It's still not Sweden. So every country that is not Sweden, that has 100 of 100 points, should be actually, perhaps the Red Army may come in and take care of this country. But what you end up, of course, is at the end is a situation like in some of the worst countries and territories of the world. Western Sahara, North Korea. These are countries that are in approximately the same rank as the Eastern Donbas. And Crimea is ranked somewhat higher. So, and that is the whole rhetoric is, as Halya mentioned, is very neo-Soviet. The very name of these republics, People's Republics, Republic of Poland, that was not quite the People's Republic. Yeah, and you have these. And the problem is that many people in the West buy that, and indeed Ukraine is not perfect in every way, and Ukraine has far-right groups, and they are very weak, and they are not in parliament, but still they are there, and that is constantly mentioned, and the human rights situation is not ideal in Ukraine, also not ideal. But it's, of course, 62 out of 100 points is much better than 5 out of 100 points. Yeah. And so the.
Well, I think. Maybe Halya, you would like to.
No, I just probably sort of slightly anecdotal on that subject, but I mean, there was so much warmongering by Russia during this 2014, particularly in the West. I remember the OSCE media representative and other people like that would constantly talk about the need for dialogue and the need for this and that, and we must hear both sides. And of course, Russia was filling Donbas with awful lies, where there was some fake woman talking, fake actress talking about how she had seen a child being crucified, after and there was a whole program by Russia Today where they showed supposed genocide in Ukraine and genocide of the Russian speaking population and nonsense like this. But while all of this was happening, while Russia was throwing this, and to a large extent, as Andreas says, I mean, it was reaching an audience in the West, which was most unfortunate. While all of that was happening, these sort of militant leaders, they after the catastrophe with MH17. They very quickly put in a sort of official Ukrainian in the Donetsk Republic, and there was one in the Luhansk one anyway. And both of these two individuals, during some sort of meeting or something, started talking about the pathetic Jews in power in Ukraine. And of course, it was so completely against the kind of narrative which was supposed to be, that Donbas was fighting the fascist Ukrainians or something. And, in general, I mean, yes, I agree with you. I mean, obviously, government-controlled Ukraine also has its, major problems. But I think there is just such I mean, if in order for somebody to go and visit Donbas at the moment, you can, well, if you look at the people who go to Donbas and you look at who they are politically, they are generally either very, very extreme left-wing occasionally, or very, very far right. You almost never, and they always are pro-Russian. Yeah, I mean, you know, all of the people who supposedly went as observers for some fake elections in November 2014, the observers to these things were very, very dodgy people from various European countries, most of whom were known for their, you know, for their generally far right views, sometimes neo-Nazi views. And, you know, these were the people who were supposedly friends of these people's republics who were fighting the fascists in Ukraine. It was all totally confused. But unfortunately, you know, as well, I mean, you know, it's you need a considerable amount of effort to actually fight that sort of propaganda. And I'm very concerned at the moment about the situation within Donbas, because occupied Donbas, because, you know, it is very clear that without any sort of pluralism, without any free media, and with the situation at the moment, then children, you know, who really probably don't remember anything before 2014 are, you know, in immense danger of just sort of not actually even having any idea that they are being indoctrinated. You know, at least people in the West in principle had some choice of what, you know, what they read. I mean, very many people don't take the choice that is offered to them, but I mean, but in Donbas, you don't have that choice, and it is very, very worrying. So I'm just trying to, yeah.
Interesting, thank you. And we will certainly return to several of the issues you have raised. Andreas, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, maybe I would just say that we haven't yet with Halya here spoken about a topic that is mentioned in her report also, which is maybe actually the most problematic in terms of human rights, namely the prisons and detention system in these two pseudo-republics. But we will have a separate report on that, co-authored by Stanislav Aseev, whom Halya Coynash already mentioned, who was for 31 months a prisoner in this detention system, and where we will talk in more detail about the prisoners, the torture system, and also the political significance and the role as political commodity of the prisoners, who are then used in prisoners exchanges to get people that have been detained in government-controlled Ukraine, and also to exert pressure within the Minsk trilateral contract group to gain for political gains. So this is something that is also dealt with in Halya's report, and that we will have a separate report on, and also a separate maybe a separate webinar as well on. And so that's why we have not yet dealt with here with that so much in detail. Well, we have now spent 25 minutes already. We could go on with.
Yeah, I'll just say, could I maybe just on the subject, because yes, I was sort of avoiding the subject of prisoners, though I have to say that it is really very difficult to do so, because actually everything about these you know, kind of entities is that, you know, you feel that people really are not, you know, there's a lack of any safety. One thing, as far as the you know, the reports of torture, the reports of people being abducted and so forth, I mean, as well as the varying reasons, the fact that some of them are just for straight criminal reasons, you know, one of the issues You know, I think it must be something about the thingy bob. I keep forgetting. What I wanted to say was that a lot of the people who've actually been there report a degree of Russian involvement in these places that, you know, it's hard to prove. You know, one of the reasons that Russia has had such success in convincing the world about this sort of completely false narrative of some sort of civil war in Ukraine is that, of course, you know, it is difficult for a lot of people to actually determine who was a Russian-speaking Ukrainian and who was a Russian. But certainly from the reports of many of the people, there are two things. One of them is that you know, you are aware that many of them have actually probably been imprisoned because of what they could expose about Russian involvement. I mean, for example, there is a nurse who was, you know, who acknowledges that yes, she did indeed give a list, but I mean, the list was of Russian soldiers who were actually being treated in I think Donetsk, I've forgotten where, but in Ukraine. Now, I mean, Russian soldiers had no right to be in Ukraine fighting in a Ukrainian civil war in Donbas, but they were there. And so, of course, I mean, she was tortured, she was imprisoned. The other thing is that, you know, many of the people who have been in those conditions and have actually been released, you know, and they really are hostages. I mean, these are, as Andreas says, I mean, these are people who are being kept for situations that are convenient for Russia. You know, many of them have spoken of being held by Russians. Some of them who've actually admitted that, you know, told them who they are. You know, it's hard to prove. You know, that you don't necessarily have their documents, but you know, there are reasons for that. On the subject, by the way, just very quickly, and then I'll stop, but I mean, on the subject of you know, people being hostages for exchanges, I think it is worth noting that that one of the people, I mean, everybody knew about Oleg Sentsov and you know, several other of the prisoners, but particularly Sentsov. Now, he was released in September 2019 in exchange for somebody who was almost certainly either an extremely important witness or a positive suspect in the MH17 downing of MH17 over occupied Crimea, occupied Donbas, excuse me. You know, now this was a Ukrainian national whom Russia wanted freed from possible contact with the Dutch prosecutor. And, you know, I mean, this is the degree to which these arrangements of why they want these prisoners and who they are released for shows Russia's involvement, Russia's motives, and very, very worrying. Anyway.
We are getting a few comments already now in the Q&A, and I would like to encourage all the attendees that, you know, please write your questions already now. We see them, and I will certainly address them with the panelists. I would just like to offer Andreas maybe an opportunity to summarize your, if you would like, your sort of introductory remarks.
Well, I think the a summary could be easily found, or more detailed information could be easily found in the already mentioned reports of the Officer on Human Rights, the Human Rights Sub-Organization of the UN. What I'm just wanted to mention here in conclusion, that I'm stunned how little this very detailed information about torture, imprisonment, lots of violence is not yet reflected in journalism. I see very little about of that in Western journalism. We have lots of testimonies of dozens of people recorded in detail, and I think one of the reasons that, you know, we should be doing this webinar and writing these reports is just to draw attention to all of this already available information. And of course, the UN is not the only organization that is summarizing and collecting this information. There are human rights non-governmental organizations that also are reporting regularly, for instance, in cooperation with the Deutsch-Russischer Austausch, German-Russian Exchange, which is a German NGO in Berlin that is sort of facilitating these NGO human rights reports. So we have a lot of actually information published already that sustains this low 5-point score that Freedom House has given to the Eastern Donbas, what it calls the Eastern Donbas. That means the occupied territories of the Ukrainian Donbas. But I find it surprisingly little reflected in journalistic work, and that is maybe what I want to say in conclusion, because there's in a way so much to say that it's actually difficult to summarize, and we need much more sort of popular information that is not hidden in some large PDF document, but is outlined in smaller articles in large circulation newspapers and widely read websites.
I know, I completely agree. Yeah, I think there is a major problem with the lack of attention generally. The same applies to occupied Crimea, where, you know, aside from one or two political prisoners, well, in Crimea they almost don't talk about political prisoners, and they should be, because I mean the numbers are huge, the sentences are absolutely massive, and you know, and the same applies in Donbas. I mean, with Donbas, the situation is slightly more difficult because actually in most of the cases you can't really even fathom what has happened until a person is released. But you know, but as you say, Andreas, many of them have been released, and there's plenty of option to talk to Stanislav. He's not the only one. There are a few other people who can tell equally harrowing stories of what, you know, of what they saw, what they experienced themselves. And yeah, somehow it seems to be a story that people are, you know, and it would be very, very important, because actually, you know, it's the more that we can actually break down that sort of narrative and show the truth, you know, which Freedom House did very adequately with their numbers. I mean, you know, absolutely perfect.
Thank you. There's a lot to reflect on already in your introductory comments and discussion, and certainly I think we could continue for a long time, and I see there's a great interest among the attendees for the situation. One question from Michael, who wonders about the criminal justice system, so to speak, in the occupied territories. How do they deal with the issue of common criminals? We will have to presume that there's a sort of an ordinary criminal system in place as well, not just against political opponents, but against ordinary criminals. How has this changed over time? Michael asks.
Interestingly enough, I mean, I can answer about the people who were actually in prison at the time of the war. At least one of them has had an extra sentence added. Almost certainly, this was almost certainly plundering. They simply wanted his property, and so, you know, it was easier for them. As far as what actually happens, I mean, it's a very good question. It's probably very difficult to tell, because, I mean, in principle, yes, there are criminal codes. According to my colleagues who've, you know, looked into this, the Donetsk one is slightly more, you know, there is slightly more concern about sort of at least giving a pretense of rule of law, not rule of law, no, but a pretense of actually following this sort of the norms of the criminal code in Donetsk, and there are in the Luhansk, you know, whatever it's called, the LNR. But whether that actually means that a person who has sort of stolen something and been caught in either of these two entities can expect a fair trial. I would personally be very skeptical, but I mean, I don't know that anyone has been able to actually sort of, you know, have any statistics on the subject. Andreas, are you aware of anything?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I just can only say that there is still a sort of criminal justice system, which is, of course, skewed by the fact that often the same criminal justice system is then basically used to further theft by the power holders, and then it's misused basically. But there's actually, I remember seeing scenes of very harsh treatment of criminals within the DNR, LNR. There is a horrible video on YouTube about the whipping of somebody, I think, who was accused of smuggling drugs, and who was whipped on camera, and this is shown, and this is quite consciously shown, so to discipline everybody. And so there is some sort of harsh criminal justice system there. Stanislav has also told me that he has been sitting together with criminals. So it's a mixture in the prisons. He has been, there's a mixture of political prisoners, of ordinary criminals. Oddly, a lot of the so-called insurgents, the so-called opolchenцы, are also in prison. You know, they all sit together, and it's a sort of it's a system that is very arbitrary. But there is still, of course, also criminal justice. But it is skewed, as I mentioned, by the fact that often actually it's then used to expropriate people, to take over, to raid companies, and so on. So I think that's an entire new sort of research stream that is coming up here, because they're, you know, of this sort of the private law and issues that are involved in all of this, the expropriations, the treatment of ordinary criminals, the use of the state for by these power holders to gain private gains, and not just out of ideological reasons. So a lot of it is coached in ideological language, but often there may be very very ordinary, very primitive motives behind them.
One just a very small little detail that comes to mind is not of criminal behavior, but it is of behavior that they are criminalizing in these, you know, pseudo republics, which is, you know, there are people who were getting, I think, is it methadone, the replacement treatment for drug addicts. And one person was released about a year ago after being held hostage for a long time. Another woman at the moment is a hostage in Donbas, and is basically, I mean, her life is in danger, because, you know, they have imprisoned these people after finding what was completely legally produced, legally provided, legally given, I've forgotten the word, I'm sorry, but medication that they obtained legally was found on them in these, you know, by the militants who have then imprisoned them. And, you know, the woman at the moment, I think she's been officially sentenced to, I've forgotten how many years, something like 11 years. You know, she's certainly not, I mean, if she is not released soon, I can't mention the name because it's not allowed, but because of the condition she has, but I mean, in her case, if she is not released soon, then really her life is you know, terribly in danger. You know, that's the sort of situation where things that shouldn't be criminalized are criminalized. I suspect there are others like that.
I will bracket this discussion because we have, for the sake of the auditorium, where there are more questions. So there's one question from Heinz who wonders about the potential role of the United Nations or the OSCE. Are they present in these territories, and how If not, what can be done? Now Sweden, he mentions the Swedish government as a chairmanship in the OSCE, for example.
Who? Are you or me? Okay, me.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, the OSCE has their monitors. But as far as, for example, the secret prisons, which we know about and which Stanislav Asiev will talk about with experience, and with a large number of the hostages who are held, the OSCE isn't, the monitors are not being given access to them. As far as the United Nations, the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, is it? Yes. I'm not sure. I mean, once again, I think the same thing applies, that there are certain things that they are denied access to. And, you know, these are very, very important areas, like, you know, of critical importance as far as human rights are concerned, where basically they are being prevented from seeing it. There needs to be more pressure put. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think the pressure probably needs to be on Russia, because, you know, I mean, whenever they refuse access, then it's largely because Russia is actually encouraging them to do so, I think. So I suspect that much more needs to be done in this area. But what Sweden can do, I mean, well, maybe Andreas has some good ideas, because I certainly think it's important. And
yeah, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is certainly has a large presence there. It's also a relatively well-funded mission with a large budget, with large staff, and with access also to the occupied territories, but not to all of the areas within these occupied territories. We will also have a separate report that will be the third in this series on the special monitoring mission. So I don't want to talk here too much about that, where the problems of the special monitoring mission are outlined. But the recommendation I would give is what I mentioned already, is that we have the very detailed reports of the special monitoring missions. We have the large regular reports of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights of the United Nations. And these are they are packed in a language, and they are packed in a format that is not easily digestible. So what I think perhaps also the international organizations could, like the OSCE, could get more into is to make that actually understandable, to translate the language of these partly technical reports into easily understandable smaller bites of information that will reach a wider public, because we have actually a lot of information, and also people like Stanislav Asiev have already given lots of interviews, and that has all been recorded, and the Office of the High Commissioner actually bases the conclusions about, for instance, the most notorious isolation or izolatia prison, which is also called a concentration camp, simply because of the especially bad conditions there. They are not based just on Stanislav's testimonies. There are dozens of people who have been there and who all report the same. So we actually published already with Stanislav a small piece on the izolatia, and one of the responses was, I can't remember, was it in Facebook or basically below, but you know, this is just one guy saying something, allegedly what happened there somewhere, and you know, how do we know it's true? But actually we know already, because you know, there are these large reports with lots of details, when did, who, what. We also know already lots of the names of the perpetrators, actually. And these perpetrators, they should be subject to sanctions. They should be named and shamed, and for some reason that has not yet been picked up by the international mass media. I'm not sure how much the OSZE can itself really go into this, especially since Russia is a part of it and will probably try to prevent something like that happening. But this information transfer is, I think, something that would be very useful from my point of view.
Can I just, yes, just one thing that you just reminded me of in terms of these reports that we get from the, and making them digestible. The OSCE's monitors occasionally, and not that seldom, report in their article, in their daily reports, but the reports are large and they are generally full of very difficult geographical locations of what they saw here or there, and it's northwest there and something, and it's very hard to read with attention, I have to say. But suddenly in the middle of these reports, you will suddenly see that their drones observed movement on dirt roads near the border between Russia, the uncontrolled border between Russia and Ukraine, in places where there was no border crossing. And you will suddenly understand, I mean, that this has happened many times, where you are actually given absolute proof that Russia is bringing, well, absolute proof, very close to absolute proof, that Russia is sending weapons and things. On one occasion, I think the drone was actually downed, almost certainly because it had noticed what was believed to be a missile carrier being carried, at night on dirt roads in a place by the border, which was not being, where there was no border crossing. I find it very frustrating. I mean, I try to write about it, and of course it becomes very boring because, each time it happens, or each time I notice it, I will try to write about it simply because I want it recorded in a way that is readable, because it's very hard to read in these reports, and you just miss all of these things. I found it very strange that it doesn't get more attention. I mean, this is supposedly, all of these people, like the ones that you talk to, or the ones that argue that this is a civil war in Ukraine. I mean, what is happening in the middle of the night when they're bringing all these, missile carriers into Ukraine? It needs more attention, and it's frustrating that it doesn't get it. The OSCE is not, its mandate is not to give opinions, but they do give you the details if you look for them.
We have a question from Annika Marie, wondering about any current human rights protection initiatives in the occupied territories, or is the border too closed, or the situation too dangerous for people to enter the territories in order to work on human rights situation?
She wanted to know about human rights initiatives from other countries, or
yeah, for example, from NGOs, for example, I presume it could be NGOs operating from Ukraine, or it could be other initiatives from outside.
Ukrainian ones, no. There was a Czech initiative that was very important and doing an awful lot of humanitarian work. I think it was closed. It was expelled from DNR maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not sure if they've been allowed back. I think there are humanitarian, strictly humanitarian missions, and I mean the Red Cross is there. So yes, I mean from the point of view of humanitarian aid, there is some. I mean, I think the EU is even sending humanitarian aid. Obviously, the sorts of things that we've been talking about, the ones that Andreas just mentioned with izolyatsiya and so forth, those are the ones that remain secret, and then there is no way of getting to them. But from the point of view of just ensuring that people don't starve, yes, there are humanitarian things.
We have one question from William about ethnic minorities. Have they been affected in any particular way by the?
Do you want to answer, or shall I? Why don't you? Oh, okay. Well, I mean, as far as a lot of people from various communities actually left at the beginning. I mean, I know that was true. I mean, a lot of Jewish people left, a lot of Muslims. In terms of sort of ethnic minorities in Ukraine, I mean, I suppose it depends what they mean by that. But I think in general, from what I have understood from, for example, Sayyid Ismailov, who is the Mufti of the spiritual directorate of Ukrainian Muslims, you know, he has reported that, you know, as far as he is aware, Muslims who stick very, very closely to what is allowed, which is probably very similar to what is allowed in Russia, can continue worshipping. But anybody who is very, very slightly outside that extremely rigid mode of what is allowed, they are likely to face problems, and a lot of them have left for that very reason. I'm just trying to think who else is meant by ethnic minorities, to be honest. Andreas, any thoughts? I mean, I don't...
Well, the largest ethnic minority in even in the occupied Donbas would be the Russians, the ethnic Russians.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
They have no problem. So, but I don't think that the ideology and the sort of the outlook of these regimes is really, these are not ethnocracies in the, they, you know, they are parts of the Russian world, they are instruments of Russian imperialism and so on, but this is not something that by itself, ethnicity is not something by itself that is crucial for these regimes. It's more, you know, how these minorities relate to Russia and to Ukraine. That is not actually that much of a problem. It's more a problem of conformity,
yes.
non-conformism, and then certain structures are allowed or not, but it's not tied necessarily to the ethnic issue.
I think I completely agree there, and I think, you know, I mean, I think also the other thing is, you know, the sort of very anti-Ukrainian part of all of this. You know, I'd completely forgotten that. Yes, of course, Russians are an ethnic minority, but of course, at the moment, you know, the propaganda push in both these you know entities is that they are trying to sort of create the illusion that there is some sort of Russian Donbas. You know, a lot of the Ukrainians who actually supported those, the militants, were people who actually really wanted to become part of Russia. I mean, they had this idea, you know, back in 2014, they were hoping that Russia would annex Donbas as it had Crimea. And at the moment, there are various reasons for what is happening at the moment, but they seem to be very much pushing this idea of a Russian Donbas, which is, you know, the history behind it is complete fiction, and the propaganda is also very, you know, scary. But you know, but I think probably the main group, and this is part of the whole thing about conformity, is that the main group who are really at risk are anybody who actually wants to show themselves as being Ukrainian. I mean, it is positively dangerous to speak Ukrainian in any part of occupied Donbas. And it would be very dangerous. Well, it has been, because we know from some of the hostages who were released later, you know, just showing a Ukrainian flag is an act of great courage in those areas. They're not the minority, they're not an ethnic minority, but it is part of this thing, you know, that you know, the anti-Ukrainian thrust of it all means that they're the ones who are actually in danger in you know, in Ukrainian Donbas.
Yeah. We have one comment from Levan Variani at the Embassy of Georgia here in Stockholm. He makes a reflection on the similarities between Abkhazia and South Ossetia and the situation in eastern Ukraine. And he wonders if you see any possible solution to ensure human rights situation in territories such as these. What can be done?
Who starts? Well, okay. I mean, I'm afraid here, I have to say that I completely agree about these similarities. And I would say that my main concern here would be that there needs to be more Western pressure on Russia. I don't see any kind of sort of, small little steps, when you're dealing with the wrong people who are not in control. The people who are in control are, at the moment is the country that is in control is Russia, and there needs to be pressure from the West. I think it could easily, they could step up pressure, sanctions, for example, and I think they should. Smaller efforts on a small scale. I mean, yes, they can help an individual who's in need, and even just publicity can. I mean, a Ukrainian who'd been living in Spain for many years, an artist, went to Donetsk, to her flat, and she removed was it the Russian flag or the supposed DNR flag? But she removed, I think it was the Russian flag. They had forcibly put it on her balcony, and she removed it, and she was seized. Now, the enormous pressure, the enormous publicity that caused, did end up with her being released. So kind of publicity in that sense can help, but I think Western governments need to do more. Myself.
Yeah, I can only support that, and we have that actually in Halya's report at the end in the recommendations. There are 8 recommendations that deal with exactly that. The situation is, of course, very comparable to those in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but there is a difference here that may actually play some role, is namely that Russia herself oddly does not recognize these so-called People's Republics. The same goes for Transnistria. But it does recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia as supposedly independent states. So in a way, it may be actually easier here to come to a solution. So we have basically 3 types of occupation here, or of annexation, you could even say, in substance annexation, the real annexation of Crimea, also in Russia's terms, done and ratified in legal terms. Then we have the recognized states of Abkhazia, by Russia recognized pseudo-states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then the LNR, DNR, and the Transnistrian Republic as unrecognized entities supported by Russia. And the problem here of these unrecognized also statelets is that they do not even, like Crimea, have the sort of the Russian system, which provides some sort of human rights protection. Where on Crimea you can, the human rights situation is also pretty bad, but at least formally there is some. You could sort of refer to Russian laws there, and here you have a sort of these territories are basically left in limbo, and you have these sort of warlords, these very dubious people reigning there. My colleague Nikolai Mitrokhin has called this the invasion of the Farsianye, the Farsians, not the Martians, but the farcical people.
Very good.
Power, whom nobody knew before. There's no prominent Donbas politician, doctor, professor, intellectual who is part of the elite of these pseudo republics. And therefore, I think the only solution really is to improve the human rights situation there is to get these territories either immediately back under Ukrainian control, or to install there an international civilian administration, perhaps combined with the UN peacekeeping mission. So that is perhaps intermediate stage that would have to be introduced here as well. That is, I think, the only way actually to come to a substantive improvement of the human rights situation.
I think just on on this subject, the reason that Russia really is he needs to be the target is because actually, if you look at anything that is happening in these pseudo republics, I mean, yes, I mean the people themselves are very. I mean, the most we know about them is that some of them are dodgy, sort of like had a dodgy criminal past before they were given power. It is Russia that calls the shots. I mean, at the moment, for example, Ukrainian soldiers are dying in Donbas. They've obviously. There was supposed to be a ceasefire. Ukraine hasn't changed its behavior. There has clearly been some sort of either units sent in or else just simply an order to sort of step up the attacks. This is not something that is being decided by any, the individuals that Andreas was just talking about, these, I mean, they may be interested in sort of like, plundering or something, but they're not interested in making those, well, they don't have the power to make those sorts of big decisions. And here, yes, I think in order for a decision to be made, Russia has to be made to hurt. I mean, it has to be made to hurt Russia. At the moment, until it hurts Russia to have this situation, this totally indefinite situation where, it's not recognizing them, but it is providing huge amounts of help and openly providing some of the help, not the military, but it does openly provide other help. Until it starts hurting Russia, then they're going to find it quite convenient to have the present situation, and yeah.
Halya and Andreas, we have reached the end of this webinar. 1 hour passed, in a flurry, and it's apparent that we could continue for a long while. At our institute, we will continue to keep focus on these sort of topics throughout the year. And as Andreas mentioned, we have several more publications on the human rights situation and similar topics regarding not only Eastern Ukraine, but also other countries in the region that are relevant for our understanding, our proper understanding of what's happening. And I would just like to, on behalf of all attendees, thank both of you for joining us here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to actually talk about this, because as we both said, it's an area that doesn't get enough attention. So thank you.
Thanks from my side.